solve large, intractable problems.
It's a new venture altogether.
Your brain is a wild horse there.
Because remember, writing is not a team sport.
You are not selling horse carriages when there are cars.
I want to be known only as the trusted advisor.
More like a tourist.
Play to Potential podcast.
Back to the discussion around people. The other very interesting and possibly borderline counterintuitive insight was you talking about Mavericks, company men and rogues.
Yeah.
And more specifically, HUL's treatment of Mavericks.
Yeah.
And you go on to say that sometimes companies get too harsh with these people, and that's a lost opportunity.
Yeah.
So talk to us about what you mean by these terms and more specifically, how HUL deals with some of these Mavericks.
It's a bit like the entrepreneurship point where it's common, kind of gripe within the organization to say we're not entrepreneurial enough. And there's a common gripe within the organization, and a lot of people repeat it saying this is a clone organization. Everybody is the same. And that's how that's the starting point, right? But when I actually started speaking to people about HUL and people who've been, joined in the 50s to now, a lot of the conversation actually came up, and people who were idealized were people who were Mavericks. I mean, I gave you the example of V. Kasturirangan, but there were several others like this. So, and they were able to associate those Mavericks with distinct periods of great success of the company, and they were able to attribute it to those people. So I think the interesting thing about HUL is that a lot of people look the same and speak the same language, but there is this a group of people who aren't the same and who are still allowed to flourish in the company. And it's not that easy in a lot of multinationals for that to happen. And I was speaking to a consultant friend of mine, and I was telling him, look, this is what I found. I found a lot of the successes I'm able to attribute to people and people who have and did very well. They didn't go to the very top of HUL, I must tell you, but they did pretty much near the top. And he said a lot of companies, it's fashionable to over-index on teamwork, and ultimately what's important is output. Teamwork's an input, right? So you can't. It's not an end in itself. So this sort of, and again, I guess it goes back, DJ, to this collegial camaraderie and this group of people who are there together in a sort of almost familial sense. So unless someone lacks integrity and rogues, which the company has again traditionally had very strong value systems on, and they kind of get ejected, there's a reasonable amount of tolerance for these, may not be great team players, but value creators, and a lot of respect for them as well. So, I think that's I spoke to people, I think it's a relatively unique secret sauce of HUL. It's not obvious because people look the same educational background and so on, but you think about it, it sort of ties in with the entrepreneur professional argument. In fact, I think it is the secret sauce if I were to kind of...
Very interesting. And maybe to make it real, Sudhir, what are the moments of truth? And what are the kind of situations where you need to be patient or tolerant with Mavericks? What's the friction that you need to live with for Mavericks to flourish?
The reason that HUL is able to tolerate and live with Mavericks for a long time, again, goes back to some of the HR processes. I think there are strong meritocratic evaluation processes, and a lot of the KPIs are quite output driven. Now, some organizations find it hard to have output-driven KPIs by the very nature of what they do. I think one of the advantages in the business that we are in is at senior management again. One is we're able to, since again it goes back to some of the earlier points, which is since you give a lot of latitude for the first 10 years, and you're not really evaluating people in the first 10 years, sort of Mavericks, coast along. And that's really where Mavericks really have the most friction early on, right? Once they come to senior management where judgment starts to play a role, Mavericks tend to be good decision makers. So it allows the Mavericks to come to middle management or senior management and then flourish. I think it's got good output-related KPIs where if you're bringing in the bacon, there's a reasonable amount of tolerance. So I would say it's a combination of these two, but probably the first one. Probably what, one of my former bosses, he calls it, I think he calls it a empathetic meritocracy, which is not a hard meritocracy. If you have a hard meritocracy in investment banks or whatever, as you are 2 years and then you're out, it won't have tolerance for Mavericks. Because early on when things can't get attributed, people who conform get more attribution than those who don't conform. That's what happens early on, right? So the fact that you don't evaluate for 10 years or you don't hard evaluate and you're kind of supportive throughout, I think that's probably what when I think about it, more than the sort of KPI thing, I think this is probably why it's like a family which allows the sort of black sheep of the family to still be till suddenly, you discover a talent of that person and suddenly somewhere it flourishes, So that's probably why.
Got it.